You know that feeling when you see something and your brain just refuses to accept it? That's exactly what happened in 1968 when Bill Jenkins posted a time that had absolutely no business existing. Competitors went quiet. Not the excited kind of quiet, the confused kind. Grown men who had spent their whole lives around race cars were looking at each other thinking, that's not possible. That car cannot run that number. So they did what racers do. They went home, tore apart their own engines, lost sleep, second-guessed everything, and kept losing. Because the gap wasn't in their engines at all. It was in Jenkins' chemistry. Before that Camaro ever touched a drag strip, Jenkins had pulled every body panel off that car and submerged them in nitric acid. He let the chemical reaction do something that no rulebook had thought to prevent yet, dissolve the steel. Not remove it. Not replace it. Just quietly, invisibly, make it thinner. Same panels. Same welds. Same factory appearance. Just dangerously, illegally lighter. And I mean dangerously. Those panels were so thin that at full throttle, with all that torque twisting through the chassis, that car was one bad launch away from folding in on itself. Jenkins knew that. He got in anyway. Every single time. So what kind of man does that? How did nobody catch it for so long? And what actually happened when they finally did? Because that part, almost every version of this story gets completely wrong. Stick with me. Because this isn't just a cheating scandal. It's something much more human than that. The underdog and the impossible numbers. To understand what Bill Jenkins did and why he did it, you have to understand the world he was dropped into. And that world, in 1968, was brutal. The NHRA Superstock division that year wasn't a competition. It was a demolition derby with a rulebook. Chrysler's 426 Hemi was eating everything alive. And I mean everything. These engines were producing power numbers that seemed almost fictional to people who built engines for a living. The cars wrapped around them weren't really street vehicles anymore. They were weapons wearing license plates. Mopar teams had factory engineers at the track. Factory parts delivered to their trailers. Factory money backing every decision. Ford was pouring resources into the problem from the other direction, trying to find anything that could slow the Hemi down. It was a corporate war. Fought with horsepower. And the people with the biggest checkbooks were winning. And then there was Bill Jenkins. A machinist from Pennsylvania who had no corporate backing, no factory pipeline, no team of engineers behind him. Just a small shop, a set of tools he knew better than most people know their own hands, and a mind that worked differently from everyone else in the paddock. He had learned engines the hard way, by taking them apart when they broke, figuring out exactly why they broke, and building the next one so that it didn't. Problem by problem. Part by part. Alone. His nickname tells you everything you need to know about him. Nobody in a marketing meeting decided to call him Grumpy. That name came organically from the people around him, because Bill Jenkins had absolutely zero patience for anything that wasn't directly related to going faster. Small talk didn't interest him. Excuses didn't interest him. Politics didn't interest him. What interested him was the gap between what a car was doing and what it should theoretically be capable of doing, and closing that gap by whatever means his brain could devise. He was a racing engineer before that job title existed in American motorsport. Before teams had engineering departments and data analysts and aerodynamicists. Jenkins was doing that work alone in Pennsylvania, with a notepad and an obsession. His car in 1968 was a Camaro. A 1968 Chevrolet Camaro, running in super stock, against the full force of the Hemi armies. On paper this is not a fight Jenkins should have been winning. The Camaro was carrying more weight than it needed to. The small block Chevy was giving up cubic inches to engines that had been purpose-built to dominate this exact class. Chevrolet's factory support was inconsistent at best and absent at worst. Jenkins was bringing a knife to a gunfight, and everyone in the paddock knew it. Except the timing boards didn't know it. The elapsed times that started coming off Jenkins' Camaro didn't make sense. Not slightly off, genuinely, head-scratchingly impossible for a car built to factory specifications. Competitors would watch the run, look at the board, look at each other, and just stand there. Because those numbers don't come from good preparation alone. They don't come from a talented driver alone. They don't come from smart tuning alone. Something else was happening. Something that nobody could identify by watching the car make a pass or walking around it in the paddock. Teams started tearing into their own engines between events. Convinced they were leaving power on the table somewhere. Rebuilding carburetors. Reworking cylinder heads. Adjusting timing. Going home and staring at dyno sheets trying to find the horsepower they were obviously missing. And the gap between their cars and Jenkins' Camaro just sat there. Unmoved. Unexplained. Officials started paying a different kind of attention. Not the routine kind. The quiet, watchful, something doesn't add up kind. Because in a sport where 1/100th of a second is the difference between a champion and an also-ran, a car that is consistently running numbers it has no right to run is not just an interesting anomaly. It's a problem that needs an explanation. The explanation existed. Jenkins knew exactly where it was. And he had hidden it in the one place nobody thought to look. Not under the hood, not in the engine bay, not in any of the places where experienced officials had spent decades learning to find secrets. He had hidden it in the steel itself. And to the naked eye it was completely, perfectly, maddeningly invisible. All right. Let's talk about chemistry. And I know what you're thinking, but stay with me. Because what Jenkins figured out isn't complicated. It's actually so simple that once you understand it, you'll spend the next 10 minutes wondering why nobody thought of it sooner. Every steel car body has thickness. That's not a profound statement, that's just manufacturing reality. Factory steel panels on a 1968 Camaro are pressed to a specific gauge, a specific, standardized measurement of how thick that metal is. And that thickness has weight. Every millimeter of steel across every panel on that car is contributing to the total number that shows up on the scales at tech inspection. Now every serious superstock team in 1968 is trying to lose weight. That's not controversial, that's just physics. Less weight means better power-to-weight ratio. Better power-to-weight ratio means faster elapsed times. The legal ways to do this are well understood and pretty much exhausted by anyone competing at a serious level. Strip the interior. Run lighter glass. Pull the sound deaden. Remove anything that isn't structurally necessary. Teams had been doing all of that for years. But the body panels, those are untouchable. Factory steel, factory dimensions, non-negotiable. You cannot cut them. You cannot replace them with fiberglass or aluminum. You cannot drill them out. The rules are clear on this. But Jenkins didn't ask the question everyone else was asking. He didn't ask what can I remove. He asked something different. Something quieter. Something that the rulebook, in all its careful language, had somehow never thought to address. What if I don't remove the panels at all? What if I just make them thinner? Acid dipping works like this. You take a body panel, a door, a hood, a quarter panel, and you submerge it in an acidic solution. In Jenkins' case, nitric acid. And you let chemistry do what chemistry does naturally. The acid reacts with the steel and begins dissolving the surface. Slowly. Controlled. And here is the detail that makes this genuinely brilliant rather than just destructive. It dissolves uniformly. The acid doesn't attack one weak point or eat through a corner faster than the rest. It works across the entire surface simultaneously, pulling an even layer of metal from every inch of that panel at the same rate. So when you pull that panel out of the bath, it looks identical to what went in. Same shape. Same contours. Same factory welds along every seam. Same appearance under any visual inspection. There is nothing to see. Nothing to flag. Nothing that looks wrong to any eye examining it from the outside. It just weighs less. Significantly, measurably, illegally less. Now think about what that actually means when you scale it across an entire car. One door panel saves you a few pounds. But Jenkins wasn't doing one panel. He was doing doors, hood, trunk lid, quarter panels, roof, every major body surface on that Camaro went through the process. And the weight savings compound. You're not talking about trimming 2 or 3 pounds off the total. Done aggressively enough, done precisely enough, you could be looking at 20, 30, maybe 40 pounds stripped from a car that is supposed to be sitting at a regulated minimum weight. In a class where 1/100ths of a second determine championships, 40 pounds is not a small number. 40 pounds is a completely different car. But here is where the story stops being clever and starts being something else entirely. There is a point in the acid dipping process where you cross a line. Not a legal line, a physical one. Push the bath too long, dissolve too much material, and the steel doesn't just get lighter. It gets compromised. It loses the structural integrity that makes it function as a body panel rather than just a decorative skin. It starts to flex under loads it was engineered to handle rigidly. It starts to move in ways that factory steel should never move. And Jenkins was walking that line with every single panel on that car. At full throttle. At the moment that Camaro bit into the asphalt and all that torque loaded up through the chassis, those thinned panels were experiencing stresses that they were barely equipped to handle. The body was flexing, moving, working against itself in ways that the engineers at Chevrolet had never designed it to tolerate, because they had never imagined anyone would deliberately dissolve the strength out of their steel. One bad launch. One hard landing off a timing block. One moment where the physics decided they were done cooperating, and that car doesn't just lose a race. That car comes apart around the person sitting inside it. Jenkins understood this. He had done the calculations. He knew exactly where the edge was because he had thought about it more carefully than anyone. And he looked at that edge, and he looked at that car, and he decided the risk was acceptable. That's what separates the story from a simple cheating scandal. Because cheating, at its core, is just breaking a rule. What Jenkins did was something more specific than that. He made a calculated decision to operate in the space between what was fast enough to win and what was structurally sound enough to survive. He compressed that margin down to almost nothing and then climbed inside it at 150 miles per hour, over and over again, while the car looked completely stock to everyone watching from the outside. That's not just rule breaking. That's a particular kind of obsession. The kind that makes you either legendary or a cautionary tale, depending entirely on which way the physics decide to go on any given afternoon. The inter closes in. Here's where the story gets the kind of tension that no Hollywood writer could improve on. Because this didn't build like a movie. It built like real life, slowly, quietly, through small moments that individually meant nothing but together meant everything. NHRA tech inspection in the late 1960s was good. Really good. These weren't amateurs. These were men who had spent decades around race cars, who had seen every trick, every shortcut, every creative interpretation of the rulebook. They had scales. They had templates. They had checklists covering hundreds of possible violations. And they had something that doesn't get written into any manual: instinct. The kind that only comes from years of running your hands over cars that are trying to hide something from you. But instinct only catches what it's been trained to recognize. And nobody had ever trained these men to look for what Jenkins had done. Because nobody had ever done it before. So the suspicion didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. It started on the scales. Jenkins' Camaro kept hitting minimum weight with a consistency that felt almost surgical. Not over. Never comfortably under. Always right there, right on the knife's edge, meat after meat after meat. And here's the thing about that kind of consistency that an experienced official understands immediately. A genuinely stock car doesn't do that. A legitimately prepared factory vehicle has natural variation in its weight from event to event. Fluids, small parts, accumulated wear, real cars fluctuate. Cars that are being managed to a precise number don't. That pattern, repeated enough times, starts to feel less like good preparation and more like someone who knows exactly how much they've removed and is replacing just enough weight to stay legal on the scales. Then there were the times. Those impossible, infuriating elapsed times that kept showing up on the boards race after race. Teams were going home between events and tearing their engines completely apart. Rebuilding. Retuning. Retesting. Convinced they were missing horsepower somewhere. But the gap between their cars and Jenkins' Camaro wasn't closing. And at some point, the question stopped being what's wrong with our engines and became what is actually going on with that car. Officials started watching more carefully. Started paying attention not just to the numbers but to the pattern behind the numbers. And patterns have a way of eventually telling you something if you watch them long enough. And then it happened. One inspection. One official. One moment where a trained hand pressed against the door panel of that Camaro and felt something that stopped him cold. The steel gave. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. Just flexed slightly under the pressure of a palm in a way that factory steel simply does not do. You can spend 30 years in tech inspection and never feel that. But when you do feel it, you know instantly what it means. Your brain doesn't need time to process it. Your hands already know. He pressed again. Same thing. He looked at the panel more carefully now. Same appearance, same welds, everything looking exactly as it should. But under his hand, the truth was impossible to ignore. This metal is too thin. What happened next moved at a speed that had nothing to do with race cars. Word spread through that paddock the way bad news has always traveled in tight communities, person to person, in lowered voices, with sideways glances toward the tech bay. Competitors who had been losing to Jenkins for months, who had questioned their own skills and their own machines, who had gone home genuinely believing they simply weren't good enough. Those men were suddenly standing very still and listening very carefully. Because if what people were whispering was true, then they hadn't lost those races at all. They'd had them taken. Here's the part nobody wants to tell you cleanly. Because it isn't clean. When NHRA officials finally sat down to deal with what they'd found in that tech bay, they ran into a wall that nobody had anticipated. They opened the rulebook. They looked for the violation. And they found something deeply uncomfortable: the rule they needed didn't exist. Not in any clear, enforceable language. Not in any form that would hold up to a serious challenge. Think about what that means for a moment. Jenkins had taken those panels off that car, submerged them in acid, dissolved a calculated layer of steel, and put them back on. And when officials went looking for the specific rule that said you cannot do that, they couldn't find it. The panels were still steel. Still factory dimensions. Still the original components. The rulebook said nothing about thickness. Nothing about chemical treatment. Nothing about what a competitor could or couldn't do to steel as long as it was technically still steel at the end of the process. Jenkins had not just found a loophole. He had found a loophole so deep and so precisely calculated that it called into question whether what he'd done was even a violation at all. And Jenkins? He was exactly as unapologetic as you'd expect from a man who went by the name Grumpy. He didn't scramble for excuses. He didn't offer explanations designed to make himself look innocent. He had studied the rules, identified what they didn't say, and engineered a solution that lived in that silence. In his mind, and honestly, in the minds of more than a few people watching from the outside, that wasn't cheating. That was preparation. That was doing your homework better than everyone else in the room. Whether you agree with that philosophy probably depends on what you think competition is fundamentally about. Is it about following the spirit of the rules or the letter of them? Because Jenkins was impeccably faithful to the letter. The spirit was a different conversation entirely. But NHRA wasn't interested in philosophy. They were interested in making sure it never happened again. And in the one area where they had complete and immediate authority, the rulebook itself, their response was fast and it was surgical. Within a competitive season, new language appeared in the regulations. Specific language. Unambiguous language. Language that addressed chemical treatment of body panels in terms so precise that no one could read it and find wiggle room. Acid dipping became explicitly, permanently, inarguably illegal. There is a rule in the NHRA rulebook today that exists for one reason and one reason only. Bill Jenkins' fingerprints are all over it even though his name appears nowhere in it. But the fallout didn't stop at Jenkins. That's the part that really changed the sport. Because once the question was asked, if Jenkins was doing this, who else was? It couldn't be unasked. Teams started looking at their own cars differently. Started looking at their competitors' cars differently. The tech bay atmosphere shifted from routine verification to something with real edge to it. Real suspicion. If one man had found a gap this significant and operated inside it this successfully for this long, then the assumption that the field was clean suddenly felt dangerously naive. The investigation that began with one hand pressing against one door panel ended up touching the entire class. And the sport that came out the other side of it was more careful, more thorough, and permanently less trusting than the one that went in. One Camaro did that. One man with a bucket of acid and a very precise understanding of what the rules forgot to say. Here's what I want you to sit with as we close out this story. Bill Jenkins is not remembered primarily as a cheater. That's not his legacy. His legacy is as one of the founding fathers of what we now call professional race car preparation. The systematic, scientific approach to building a competition car, understanding every variable, attacking every inefficiency, leaving nothing on the table. That's what Jenkins represented. The acid dipping scandal is a chapter in that story, not the whole book. After the NHRA closed the door on chemical lightning, Jenkins didn't disappear. He kept building cars. He kept winning races. He kept finding edges that other people hadn't found yet, working within whatever the current rules happened to be. Because for Jenkins, the rules weren't a ceiling, they were a puzzle. And his brain never stopped working on puzzles. The technique itself, acid dipping, didn't die with the NHRA ruling. It migrated. Formula One teams began exploring chemical treatment of components in the 1970s. Rally teams used it. Weight reduction through chemistry became a legitimate field of aerospace engineering that eventually filtered back into motorsport through legal channels, applied to materials that regulations didn't restrict. The idea Jenkins had wasn't wrong. It was just ahead of the regulatory environment he was operating in. And that raises the question I want to leave you with, because I think it's genuinely worth thinking about. In every era of competition, in motorsport, in sport broadly, in business, in technology, there are people who see the edges of the rulebook not as limits but as maps. They study what's written and they notice what isn't. They operate in the white space between the lines. Sometimes what they're doing gets ruled illegal after the fact. Sometimes it becomes standard practice. The difference between those two outcomes often has less to do with ethics and more to do with whether the innovation can be contained. Bill Jenkins pressed his hand against a door panel and decided that the space between factory and illegal was worth exploring. An NHRA inspector pressed his hand against that same door panel and decided that the exploration had gone too far. Both of them were right. That tension between the engineer who pushes and the regulator who pushes back is exactly what makes motorsport worth watching. The 1968 Camaro itself? That's a story for another day. But somewhere out there, if it still exists, it's carrying panels that are just a little bit thinner than they should be. And if you know what to look for, you can still feel it. If you made it this far, you already know more about what happened in that tech bay than most people who were actually at the track that day. Bill Jenkins wasn't just a driver, he wasn't just a tuner, he was an engineer in the purest sense of the word, someone who looked at a problem and refused to accept that the obvious solution was the only solution. Whether you think what he did was brilliant or dirty probably says something about how you approach problems yourself. Drop your take in the comments. I genuinely want to know, where do you draw the line between innovation and cheating in motorsport? Because that line has been moving for 60 years and I don't think anyone has found the right place to put it yet. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about the real stories behind racing history. And subscribe, because next week we're going inside another NHRA scandal that makes acid dipping look like a minor infraction. You're not going to want to miss it. See you on the other side of the timing boards.